The teaching of purgatory comes from the Latin Limbus Patrum, or the limbo of the Father. Speaking of the ancient patriarchs, the heroes of the Old Testament, eventually the Catholic Church writes on the basis of this parable in Luke chapter 16, they write down that there must be something on the other side of eternity where you have this kind of limbo. Limbus is the Latin word, the Limbus Patrum, the limbo of the fathers. These were holy, righteous men. Did they go to hell? No, they're holy, righteous men. But they can't enter into paradise because Yeshua hadn't come yet. There's another doctrine that is closely associated with this. It has crept into many Christian circles, and that is the idea of limbus infantum, the limbo of the infants, or the limbo of the children. You'll also find this under limbus puerorum in the Latin. Children's limbo. What happens if a little kid dies? Does he go to hell? I've had someone come to me and ask me, Pastor Kane, my little child died when I was younger. What happens to him? Whew. Heavy conversation. It's usually as we're about to close up the church and they come over and they've got, their eyes are damp a little bit with some tears, and maybe you've preached something and they're still wrestling with this idea, what happens to my son? What happens to my daughter? Well, the Catholics could go back and they could say, well, we actually believe that he doesn't go into heaven, but he's not in hell either. He's somewhere in limbo, purgatory. And they base all of this off of Luke 16:22. Now, according to this theology, when Messiah dies, he descends into hell, and as he's going into Hades, he preaches the gospel to everybody who's in hell. This is where some of your ideas, some people get the idea that you can be saved after you die. He goes into hell to preach to the captives, and then what he does is he opens up the gates of Limbus, where all of these people, the Sa'ar, here's our idea of the gates again. You open up the gates of Limbus. If anybody here has ever done any study into Dante, who had a lot of real choice words with where the Catholic Church of his day was at, he had this idea, Dante's Inferno comes from this idea, and so the idea was that you had these righteous people that were kind of just waiting around for Yeshua to come, and then he eventually comes, and then he dies, and he resurrects, and when he resurrects, then he goes into the places of hell, and what he does is he preaches the gospel into hell, and everybody who receives in hell, they get saved. They get a chance to go to heaven. And he goes and he preaches to this place that's in purgatory, and all of the church fathers get to come, and they get to join, and they get to be part of this. They get to go to heaven. Now, I want to tell you guys, that's not what Yeshua is doing here at all. He is not establishing a doctrine for what will eventually become another church and another religion to call back on so that they can write a book about what happens to people after they die. What happens to the church fathers? What happened to the fathers of ancient Israel, all the righteous heroes that we see in the Old Testament? That's not what he's doing here. He is not teaching them a doctrine. He is teaching them a parable designed to get them in the here and now, the Pharisees that existed in that time, to get them to understand something. Be careful when you are reading parables to make doctrines about them, because you can very quickly find yourself in error. Keep your feet on solid ground. Don't get caught up in foolish doctrine. Paul warns people, don't get caught up in mythologies. Don't get caught up in genealogies. Don't get caught up in profitless discussions about all kinds of weird abstract stuff. So this is the teaching of Limbus Patrum. Yeshua descends into hell, preaches to the captives, opens the gates of limbo, lets out the righteous heroes, the tzaddakim, and this all happens just after his first advent. So this teaching creates a theological buffer zone. And I'm going to tell you how this emerged in the medieval ages. You could have Old Testament saints that were kind of hanging out. They weren't in hell, but they were hanging out in Limbus, in the Limbus of the Patrum, the fathers, the in limbo place where all the fathers like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob went to go. So we could make this doctrine, and this was very, very big in the medieval ages. Christians really held tight onto this doctrine. And what they would say is, there's this in-between place between heaven and hell. See, you could still put the Jews into hell. And this is what it was used to do. They wanted to make sure that the Jews could still be in hell, but the righteous hero that the Bible's that the righteous hearers that the Bible speaks of could somehow be in limbo. It created and fostered a lot of anti-Semitism. Oh, the Jews, they all went to hell, except for maybe the Limbus Patrum. Maybe some babies hanging up there with Abraham. And so if you look at some of the artwork that's of the medieval ages, and they actually try to draw ideas of what hell was like, and they try to draw ideas of what heaven is like, and then they try to draw ideas of Abraham with the baby somewhere in limbo. Not quite in heaven, but definitely not in hell. Now, I want to make an important note here. I had a chance to look into the Catechism of the 1992, and they officially said, hey, we're not going to write this into the Catechism. Up until that point, it had been taught pretty religiously in Catholic circles. From Catholic circles, it made its way into Protestant circles. You will still hear Protestant preachers talking about how Jesus descended into hell to liberate the captives. One of the passages that they reference, this is actually dealt with in Matthew chapter 27, beginning in verse 50. And Yeshua cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit, so he dies. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom, and the earth shook and the rocks were split. So Yeshua dies, he yields up his spirit. He's literally on the cross. His body's on the cross at this point. The temple veil is torn in two. There's a whole bunch on that one. What's it say? The tombs were open in verse 22, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. This is talking about the resurrection of the dead. This talking about the resurrection of the dead is directly tied to Luke chapter 16 that we're dealing with here. So verse 52, the tombs were open, many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Verse 53, and coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered into the holy city and appeared to many. So the idea here is that they kind of ignore this idea of the holy city being Jerusalem. Now the holy city is likened to the city of God. It's likened to heaven. And so what ends up happening is Yeshua dies. And this is him going into these places of hell. And all these people are being resurrected physically. This is the doctrine. I want to reference you to 17th century Hebraist. He's a Christian Hebraist. His name is Jonathan Lightfoot. He rejected this theology. Lightfoot was a powerhouse preacher. He was a very, very solid theologian, and he always took things back to understanding things from a Hebraic perspective. This is very, very important for us as Messianic Jews because he was simultaneously a believer in Yeshua, and yet he understood the Jewish perspectives that Yeshua taught from. This is what he said about this theology, dealing specifically with Abraham's bosom. He says, if our Savior had been the first author of this phrase, Abraham's bosom, then it might have been tolerable to have looked for the meaning of it amongst Christian expositors. But seeing it as a scheme of speech so familiar among the Jews, and our Savior spoke no other than the known common dialect of the nation, the meaning of it must be fetched thence, not from any Greek or Roman lexicon. In other words, Yeshua's terminology about Abraham's bosom, we can't draw from Roman Catholic doctrine on this. We can't draw from Greek ideas of doctrine on this. That's what he's saying. Lightfoot is saying you can't sit there and try to pull this out of a Catholic lexicon. You have to go back to the language and the terminology that Yeshua taught. You're fill in the blanks. In other words, what Yeshua's terminology meant to the people he was teaching at the time. If I'm talking to somebody in a language that they understand, and I'm teaching them in a language that they understand, 200 years later that phrase means something completely different, you have to go back to the original intent and language that it was being discussed by. With me? I want to leave you with a final thought here. Yeshua is teaching a parable, but there is something inherent in the parable. The passage assumes the immortality of the soul. This was a common Pharisaic doctrine. The Pharisees believed that the soul was immortal. The Pharisees believed that the soul had a beginning, but that it lived on perpetually because it was the creation of God. This is where the Pharisees and Yeshua had common ground. They both believed in the eternal nature of the soul. Yeshua believed and taught that man has an immortal soul and that the resurrection would happen after death.